Welcome to Deloitte's Debriefs tax webcast series in Asia Pacific. Our webcast today is from our Global Mobility Talent and Reward series and is entitled Global Reshaping the Future, How ESG is Redefining the Design and Operation of Total Reward. My name is Jod Gill, and I am a tax partner based in Deloitte, Singapore, and I have the pleasure of hosting today's webcast. I have two speakers with me today, my good friends Brian Ho and Simon Chapman. Brian is a partner with Deloitte Singapore, and Simon is a director who focuses on in our GS team regarding advising companies with reward-based queries. You may access our bios on the left of the screen. Before I introduce the agenda for today's webcast, I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the features of our webcast console. First, all users are on listen-only mode, and if you have any content-related questions, you can submit those at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. We will do our best to respond to your questions during the presentation, but we have allotted significant time at the end of today's presentation to cover all of those questions in detail. Second, all PC users can maximize or minimize each box at your convenience during the webcast. You may also explore the icons at the bottom of the screen. If you want to download today's slides and related publications, please go to the downloads and links box and you should be able to obtain the collateral there. Those of you who are accessing this session by mobile, you can view the slides and answer the survey on screen, hopefully through your device. And then finally, if you require an attendance record for this event, you will receive an automated email with a CPE certificate after watching for at least 50 minutes. So please do bear that qualifying time in mind. So let's move to the agenda, and we can give you an overview of the important topics that we will be covering today. First of all, we will have a primer from Brian on ESG and why it is here to stay. Simon will then take us through how to design reward offerings that align with ESG strategies. We'll then discuss how you can use reward as a reinforcer of ESG strategy and how you can start to prepare for external scrutiny in how you determine, manage, and govern reward arrangements. And then we will have time for Q&A. So without any further delay, Brian, please get us started.
Sure, thanks, John. Good afternoon, all of our audience. So this is Brian. I'm partner at Deloitte Southeast Asia, leading our sustainability practice. Today's topic, ESG, I believe everyone has heard about this term. And this is a very hot topic right now. I remember I started my career on ESG 20 years ago. At that time, no one knows that. My parents always ask, okay, what are you doing exactly on ESG? But now it's a topic that everyone is talking about that. I mean, our government, investor, banks, companies, consumers, everyone is talking about ESG. So that's why for today, we'd like to give you a very, set a scene, give you a very brief introductions about ESG. And of course, more importantly is how it will impact companies in terms of their business model and also operations. When we look at ESG or broader sustainability, there's always different terminologies, right? They also reflect the history of corporate sustainability. 20 years ago, we used the terms like corporate social responsibilities, corporate citizenship, and now we are using ESG, which is a term that focus more on risks and opportunities and also their impact to financials performance of the companies. Of course, one of the very important nature of ESG is that it is all about operational, right? If you look at all the topics here underneath, environmental, social, human capitals, governance, everything that are related back to the operational things of our companies. And this is also the reason why companies find it sometimes quite challenging to manage ESG risks and opportunities. Having said that, there's no one single department can handle this. You need to look at some joint efforts between different departments, different units, And also, this is a multidisciplinary topics as well. And more importantly, it should be integrated with your business. It shouldn't be a silo topic, right? In the past, it was quite silo because when we talk about, CSR in the past, this is about donation, charity. But if now we're talking about, if talk about risk and opportunities, we're talking about financials, it should be something more integrated with your business model, with your operations. And this is also the tough part of what we talk about ESG as well. Of course, if we look at the next page, why this topic is getting so much prominent recently, I believe in the last 10 years, there are more and more discussions. And I believe it comes from the expectations or pressure from three major group of stakeholders. Government, of course, we in Asia Pacific, we see most of the countries have a very clear target on sustainability, especially focusing on climate change, net zeros. So those aspirations on sustainability will translate into regulations. For example, I see in Singapore, there's carbon tax in Singapore. In some of the countries, there are also more stringent environmental laws and regulations, which means that there will be impact on companies in terms of how they operate and also their operating costs as well. And of course, second, investor and banks. And presume you watch YouTube, right? I mean, when you switch on YouTube, if you haven't subscribed to the premium one, then you have always a lot of advertisement, right? You can see a lot of fund manager banks. They're also selling a lot of products on sustainable finance as well. Investors are integrating ESG into their investment decisions. Where the banks, when they do the bank loan to you, they also want to look at what you're doing on ESG. And of course, they're also encouraging companies to look at sustainable financial measures, green loans, sustainability linked loan linked bonds as well. And of course, the last part comes from the market. For the general consumers, the younger generation, they all expect companies to look at eco-friendly products and solutions, as well as corporate procurement as well. I mean, for our firm, when we work with leading companies on sustainability, they will also ask for Deloitte credentials on sustainability as well. So this is what happening, right? Something that it is not good to have, but something you have to look at when you continue to a business, talk to clients, talk to investors. Now, of course, if we look to the next page, right? So, another dimensions regarding the driving force of ESG is the regulatory landscape. So, in the past, then there were not so many regulations on ESG, and most of those are voluntary actions. But now it become a mandatory one, especially focusing on ESG reporting, right? In EU, there's some new regulations last year that no matter EU companies or non-EU entities having operations there with a certain shareholder of their revenue, they need to do that. US this week, you will see that there will be some discussions at the SEC for the new requirements for listed companies on climate disclosures. And back to APEC, most of the countries in APEC have some sort of mandatory ESG reporting requirements. And at the moment, all of those are also looking at how to adopt the latest standards and require both listed companies and non-listed entities to do mandatory climate reporting as well. So there are so many requirements, right? I mean, regulators are asking for that, investor banks are asking for that, your clients are asking for that. So the question is how your organization can be competent enough to deal with so many expectations related to ESG in this very competitive kind of market landscape. Then if we go to the next page, there are several major areas that we want to look at how a company can be ESG competent to stay ahead, to look at how to meet with the expectations or how to exceed the expectations. I always believe that there are four areas that companies need to look at. First is, of course, governance. So how this part can become a business as usual for you as a company. It shouldn't be something very ad hoc. Okay, you see inquiries come from your clients and then you do something. But something that are being embedded, integrated into your organizational structure and culture. So governance is very important given that you need to have buy-in from your directors, from your board of directors, and even how you communicate back, how you're reporting back from the management to the governance will be important. So you need to have some structure to enable you to have an effective oversight of your ESG risks and opportunities, and also to help you to provide you resources, directions on ESG as well. The second one is targets. So many companies say a lot of, they have a lot of slogans, they have a lot of vision statement about ESG, right? But without a target, you are not really managing that because there will be no consequence of not achieving the targets. So target setting is important, no matter you set some directional targets or even some quantitative target. For example, many companies, they have a net zero target, decarbonization targets. So by having this target with your organizational structure, the two things can combine. And then, of course, the third one, how you can have regular tracking and monitoring. Data is important. Unlike other types of data, for example, I believe today we have a lot of colleagues specializing on finance, accounting, even in HR, we have system, procurement, we have system. For some ESG data, at the moment, not so many companies have digitalized the whole process. Data process and control on ESG data is always a challenge because, as mentioned, it's all about operational data. But without data, you cannot really manage. So how can we make sure you find your data? It will help you on one hand to improve your ESG management. On the other hand, if you need to have your ESG disclosures align with the regulatory disclosure as well. The last part is, of course, communication. No matter internally, from governance level, working management level, working level, how the communication becomes streamlined so that the top will know what's happening, and then those at working level will know what's the direction from the top. So this is very important, internal communication and reporting, but also externally as well, given that for many companies, ESG risk doesn't only come from your operations, but also from your value chain and the macro environment as well. How you can communicate with your external stakeholders on ESG will be an also very important element. So these are the four elements that when we advise companies, this will be quite essential for you to be ESG competent. And then, of course, the last one that I would like to share with you, ESG into organizational responsibility. If they talk to us, they always say, okay, I have hired an ESG manager, ESG director, or even we have a ESG departments, then we can do everything. But somehow this should be something that more than that. Because as mentioned, there's no one single department can handle so many things. Right? It links back to every single part of your operation, your business. The important part is how you can make ESG relevant to the all parties. Although you may already have or want to have an internal team with ESG expertise, but don't only rely on one person or department to drive everything. So integrated ESG into your governance and management structure. For example, at the governance level, you may want to have an ESG committee to put relevant expertise in for regular discussions, providing ideas. But you also want to make sure that other committees also have some sort of roles and responsibility on ESG as well. For example, risk committee, do they look at ESG risk, how ESG risk being integrated as a part of your enterprise risk management? For elimination committee, do you want to look at your ESG KPIs, target performance, how it links back to the executive compensation? So this is important. And of course, as a management level, ESG is so operational. So are all of your BUs and functional departments being involved in the discussions and also the direction setting as well? And of course, at the working level, do your colleagues know what's happening? Do you have any ESG champions that are being identified to execute and communicate the progress? So they're all about your organizational structure and culture, how you can support your ESG journey. So I think I'll stop here and pass it back to Joe, and hopefully we will have more discussions in the later part.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. So that brings us to our first poll of the day. We'd really like to get a better understanding from all of you, just in terms of your views regarding ESG. So as an employee, is your employer's approach to ESG important to you? So please select one of the options that you can see there in front of you. So first of all, not really. Second option, it's nice to know, but not something I think about often. Third option, yes, but other things are more important. Fourth option, yes, it impacts my decision making. And then fifth, and the final option, it is the one of the top two factors that I think about when choosing where to work. And just whilst we're waiting for those results to come in, Brian, in your experience and in terms of all the discussions that you've had in your role with Deloitte across Southeast Asia, are there any differences in attitudes towards ESG here in Asia versus other parts of the world?
Mm, yeah. This is a really good question, and I believe in some region of the world, like in EU, I mean, they have a relatively longer histories to look at ESG, and also it is of course on one hand driven by the history, on the other hand, it's driven by all the ESG. I mean, in terms of varying economic development level, also regulatory priorities and also challenges. For example, when we look at some countries, even within APAC, right? Some countries they are really high tech industries. They have a lot of high tech industries, like in Japan, like in Korea. But I mean, compared to countries in Southeast Asia that are very natural resources dependent economies, the focus will be quite different. So that it will lead to some kind of different carbon economic growth with sustainable resources management. So that's why I think when we look at the regional difference, we really need to look at that from different perspective regarding the economic, I mean the economic current state, cultural backgrounds, and also the focus sectors of the region.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Let's look at the results that have come through. And we can see there that from approximately 100 responses, we've got quite a broad range of views around what's important to you. So not really around 10 of the responses, which I guess is broadly similar to the 4 responses where it's critically important at the other end of the spectrum. And then we have the majority of responses in the middle in terms of, so 34 at it's nice to know, but something I think about often, 26 at yes, but other things are more important, and 20 at yes, it impacts my decision making. It's interesting where I think that if we had run this survey, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, we would have probably seen more responses higher up, i.e., not really, it's nice to know, but not something that I see often. And this goes back to the point that I think Brian was making, that we are seeing shifts and quite rapid shifts in terms of this becoming more of a priority. So a prediction would be, if we ran this poll in 3 years' time, that there'd probably be more of those responses, maybe at yes, but other things are more important. Yes, it impacts my decision making. And then yes, it is one of the top 2 factors I think about when choosing where to work. So now that Brian has set the scene for us, let's move into why this is really important for employers to consider ESG from an employment perspective. And this breaks down into 3 key areas regarding expectations from key stakeholders for most organizations. First and foremost are employees. And what is becoming increasingly clear is that employees increasingly expect to work for employers and organizations who mirror their own values and their own purpose. And this is particularly the case for younger generations. So, this is very much a talent imperative for organizations to ensure that they have a very clear articulation of their purpose and of the good that they are doing for society, to ensure that the talent that they wish to employ understand that this aligns maybe with their own views. Similarly, with investors, it's increasingly apparent that investors want to understand an organization's ESG strategy because it is so important from a commercial perspective. And they expect executives to be held accountable for delivering on this strategy because it is such a core part of the wider commercial strategy. Many customers of maybe your organizations, particularly those of you that are directly facing the market, your customers may well be, their buying patterns may depend upon their views of your organization and whether those align with themselves. And then the final point is the community expectations here, where what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is a significant increase in expectations from the wider community for organizations to be good corporate citizens and to be seen to be good corporate citizens. We all know that reputations can be made and destroyed, with a single social media post in this modern age. And this means that ESG conversation isn't just in the boardroom, but it is also in government, and it is at the water cooler, it is in our schools, it is in every part of our life. And a great example of this was the Singapore government's focus in our recent budget on ESG. So as Brian has just explained, ESG is very much here to stay. So at this point, let me pass over to Simon, who's now going to go into what this means from a reward perspective for organizations.
Thanks, Jordan. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. So I think you've heard from Brian and from Jod as well. ESG is everywhere, and as Brian said, what that looked like 20 years ago is no longer what it looks like today, and I think possibly not what it looks like tomorrow and going forward as well. So we are really at quite an interesting point in the journey now of ESG. And one of the words I have heard sort of used around is ESG fatigue. So we have heard about ESG in the context of almost every aspect of our life, of employment, of business. So probably the question on some people's minds would be, well, what then does ESG have to do with the way we structure pay or the way we reward our employees? So I think we saw before, it is becoming more important to all those different groups of stakeholders. And perhaps I would reframe the question as, let's not think about it as going out and developing ESG reward strategies, but thinking about it as rewarding the right way. So how are we rewarding the right way for the sustainability of our planet, for the sustainability of our people and our employees? One of the things that's come out of our latest Deloitte HR trends research is all about, with the future of work changing and the rise of different technologies, is the fact of the idea of human sustainability, which is going to make our organizations more viable going forward, and starting to look at the whole person, and when we think about our employees and our people. And then of course the final factor of how are we rewarding the right way and making the right decisions and governing that in the right way. So the question then is is the way you're rewarding helping or hindering your broader ESG strategy? So as Jod mentioned, today we will go through, looking at this under three lenses. So firstly, how is ESG a framework for making decisions about total reward? Secondly, how are we using reward then as a lever to make sure we reinforce our ESG strategies, our broader organization? And then thirdly, how are we, the G in ESG, how are we governing the way we make decisions around reward? So before I go on, I just want to stop for a second, and before we look at this slide on the E and the environmental factors, is just to recap on what we actually mean when we talk about reward or total reward. And I take a very holistic view of this. So a better term for it, an emerging term we use, is actually, what is the workforce value proposition? So it's more than just pay. It's all of the things that you offer your employees and that they make decisions around in terms of what's the proposition for them of working for you as an employer. So that, of course, does include pay, It includes all the other financial and non-financial benefits that you offer, but it also includes the ways of working. It includes, the physical and the virtual spaces that you provide to your people, as well as the opportunities for careers and development there. So just to put that into context, that's what we're talking about when we talk about total reward, because this is how our employees think about it. They don't look at it in a siloed way. So if we move then onto each of the three elements, and I start with the E, the environmental factors. So it's often a question that gets raised to say, well, how can the way I pay my people really impact the sustainability of my organization? Or how can this impact the environment? Let's look at it in sort of start with the financial aspects of your pay. So one of the really great levers we have here is look at annual bonuses or long-term incentives, any kind of variable pay. What are the measures, and then Brian mentioned this before, in terms of, what are the measures that you're actually measuring your people against? Because when you start to put measures into pay, what you're incentivizing often is what gets done. So are you actually incentivizing sustainable and long-term value creation and growth for your organization? Or are you incentivizing things that come at a cost for long-term sustainability and growth? So something to think about really clearly to make sure that there are no unintended consequences of the things that you are highlighting as important and asking your people to do through the incentives that you give them through pay. For those of you that work in markets that have the ability to direct pensions and any kind of post-employment benefits there into different funds, are you clear on what the underlying investment strategies of these funds are? Pension arrangements. Do you know where your employees' money is going? And are you communicating to them around, the different options that they have in terms of this and the different impacts on the environment? So really clear things that you can do just around communicating perhaps actually where the investment strategies lie if you do have that ability to direct. Then benefits is a really big thing, and I think something that we're seeing a lot of innovation in, particularly as organizations look to say, well, how do we align with, as Jod said, our employees want to work for organizations that align with their purposes. So if you think about the total reward offering or that workforce value proposition, how are we then structuring some of these benefits that actually align to some of these more environmental goals? So things that perhaps may have a small cost to them, such as are we offering partnerships and opportunities for employees to give back into environmental causes? We have seen quite a lot of a rise in this, and as Brian mentioned, we used to look at this from a corporate social responsibility lens, but actually looking at this now as part of your employment offering. How does that align to what your employees expect? Some great examples of providing green benefits. Small things such as end of trip facilities to allow your employees to take low emission modes to work, potentially cycling, rather than taking vehicles. Other green benefits, we've seen some great examples of organizations thinking about offering carbon offset schemes or discounts on electric vehicles if it's applicable in where you are. So some really innovative and some emerging practices in terms of what are actually green benefits here. And then the final one, I think, which is extremely topical, and we're seeing the pandemic ways of working change things quite significantly. We saw everyone working from home. We're now 4 years on. That debate has changed to people coming back to the office and what is that right balance. And a lot of the considerations of this are around, well, what do our people expect and how do they want to work? What's cost effective for our organizations and aligns to that. But the other element to this is, well, what's the environmental impact actually? And as a corporate, socially responsible and in organization, how does this align to our ESG strategy? Because if we look at this in terms of taking large numbers of people off the roads every day, actually can have a significant impact on your emissions footprint. So just taking a different lens to some of those decisions you make around your employment offering. If we then move to the S in ESG, the social element, how does this impact our reward decisions? And this is probably one that has historically been the most talked about in the context of reward, and mainly because it touches our people, our employees. So the big theme that runs through this, and one of the big things that I see, is about equality and fairness. If I look at some of the pay aspects of this, there's been a lot of discourse and particularly regulation coming into this as well around paying equally and paying. We have in Australia, for example, the gender pay reporting, and we're seeing a lot of this in the European Union as well. So how are you actually ensuring that you have equal pay for equal work across things like gender, things like other ethnicity or other demographics there, and moving in terms of as a internal function for thinking about our HR policies. How are we making sure that we don't do this by accident? What are the policies that we have in place that means that this is a systematic thing that we commit to and we can defend the way that we get to this point? Living wages is similar for those across your entire supply chain. Are you clear and can you defend that you have living wages across your entire supply chain? And that links into, again, some of the trends we're seeing out of particularly North America around, thinking about CEO and worker pay ratios. Is there a balance there, or actually are things out of line here? And again, the public discourse, the public and the community expect to see these sorts of things and have a view on what is right and what is wrong. So despite what we might think internally, and the rationale we might have internally, there is also a public perception issue here. If we move into some of the benefits, then we talked about different types of benefits and looking at them from an environmental factor, but also how are we offering and allocating these to different people within the organization? We often look at benefits and we determine benefits and who gets what based on things like hierarchy, in terms of the more senior you are in the organization, perhaps you get more or different benefits. But actually, is that of equal and is that fair across our workforces? And are we actually directing the benefits to those people who require them the most? And some great examples of thinking, as we emerge and start to think about this more innovatively, as well as overlaying, an inclusivity lens across the benefits you offer. Because are the benefits you're offering actually relevant to the people that you're offering them to? I have seen, for example, large numbers of organizations who offer very significant discounts on international travel and hotels, but also have large populations of their workforce for who these types of benefits and accessing that are actually, financially out of reach. So are we actually thinking about how we design our benefits offerings around what is actually relevant to our people and what drives the right behaviors there? And the final aspect of this is something which is really growing in popularity, is as we start to think about the whole person in terms of the people that we employ, and thinking about, well, as a total reward offering or as a workforce value proposition, how are we supporting the well-being of our people? So building that into, rather than this is a nice to have offering on the side, but actually, how are the well-being programs that support our employees with their physical wellness, their mental wellness, and their financial wellness? How are we supporting them as part of our offering? So again, looking at that whole person. And then we come to the governance aspect. And I think this is a space that is emerging, particularly across our region in Asia Pacific, is moving really quite fast. So if we look at this next slide here, we can see that, that there are a number of, and we will come to this a later section around, how do you actually get yourself ready for this? But governance requirements and expectations are changing quite rapidly. And Brian talked about some of the reporting requirements from an ESG perspective. And on remuneration, this is starting to occur no differently. So across our region, we do have different levels of regulations in different organizations, different countries, sorry. But what we are seeing, I think the consistent theme is that regulation is becoming stricter. Regulators are looking to take a more active role in how you govern and how you reward your people. So really the key things for me here are thinking about in this ESG lens and the pay lens, how are you being deliberate and defensible about the decisions you make around pay? Do you have how are you articulating the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders? And Brian mentioned this as well. We look at the interaction between the integrated nature of an ESG committee, a management committee, remuneration committee. And really, this is for me a part of the key thing around operating in an integrated way and making sure you have the right processes in place to make your pay decisions. And also that you provide the right level of data. And that doesn't mean all the data, and it doesn't mean none of the data. It means the right amount of data for people to actually make the right decisions in a timely way. And then thinking how we then take this from a transparency lens in terms of what we bring in from our people and what we communicate to the external market and regulate as well. So this is something we will delve into a little bit deeper in the coming section. But just to set the scene there, I think as you can see, under each of the E, the S, and the G considerations, there are a number of different small decisions that you can make in terms of how you design your reward offering that actually starts to align then with the principles of your ESG strategy. But I think, as we look deeper into this, more innovation will come. So I think this is just the beginning, but something I'm very quite excited about.
Thank you, Simon. Let's take the opportunity to move to the second poll of the day. Now that you've heard from Brian and Simon in terms of setting the scene and what that means from a reward perspective, we'd like to get a sense from you in terms of how you expect your current employer to incorporate ESG into your employment framework. So again, there are a number of options here. First of all, not at all. ESG is not important in the context of reward. The second one is benefits should be aligned to our ESG principles. The third point is our ESG strategy should be the guiding framework for all reward design decisions. Fourth is executives should be held to account for the organization's ESG performance through pay. And the fifth is all employees should be held to account for their own and the organization's ESG performance through pay. You may feel strongly about a number of these options, but we're deliberately asking you to choose the one that you feel strongest about. So whilst we're waiting for those responses to come through, Brian, maybe if I could kind of bring you back into the conversation here, we've just seen organizations from a strategic perspective.
Sure.
Is any one of those more important than the other for organizations here in the region?
I see. Yeah. So I believe in the context of developing the ESG framework for the companies, there's no single pillar stands above the others. Of course, the importance should shift based on the context. For example, industry, geographies that you operate, and how your value chains looks like, and more importantly, the expectations from your stakeholders. Of course, when we look at the discussions globally, the environmental pillars is somehow draws a lot of attentions, and this is really critical in terms of addressing climate change, and also looking at how you can reduce your ecological impact and also resources sustainability as well. This is also the reason why when we look at APAC, when most of the regulators put in regulations, climate come first. But of course, when we look at other pillars like social, which are including elements such as companies' internal and external relationships, labor practices, diversity, community engagement. These will be also the keys for reputation and resilience, especially for some types of the companies. And governance, of course, always set the important one that sets the company's ethical directions, ensuring the ESG integrations into your business strategies and risk management. So as mentioned, industry and regional kind of characteristics can also sharp away the focus as well. For example, many tech firms, they may lean towards the social part, how they can have inclusiveness, social inclusiveness, and also governance, where the energy sector may emphasize on environmental issues. So when companies need to define what's the real meanings of ESG to them, they will really need to consider the elements that I've just talked about: sector, geographical locations, your stakeholders, and your value chain, so that you can map and think about what are the topics that will be applicable for you to have an effective management.
Thank you, Brian. That's very insightful there. Okay, so let's have a look at the results that came back. Interestingly, a fairly similar result to what we saw in the first poll in terms of the two ends of the spectrum. In terms of ESG is not important and all employees should be held account. Fairly similar groupings there in terms of 12 votes for each. In terms of that, the most popular there is benefits should be aligned to our ESG principles, which I think we're definitely seeing as a very common approach for most organizations at this moment in time. But increasingly, as Simon and Brian have mentioned, I think we'll start to see even more focus, even over the 18 and 16 of you that voted for these options, but that ESG strategy is going to become more of a guiding framework for some of these reward decisions. And executives should be held account for the organization's ESG performance through pay. So just before I ask Simon to focus specifically on that response there around executives being held to account, I just wanted to remind you that if you have any questions for us, please do pop them into the question box on your screen, and then we should have time at the end of the session to pick them up. But in the meantime, I will throw back to Simon to talk about how reward can be a reinforcer of that ESG performance.
Thanks, Jod. And I think you're really interesting looking at those results of the poll there, particularly the spread. But what I do take away from this, though, is it echoes what we're seeing in the market and sort of the general conversations around how and if should you actually should people be held to account for ESG performance. And as Brian said, initially, it's one thing to have a strategy, but actually, are you making a commitment to it, and how are you actually putting steps in place to do that? And of course, holding people to account and pay is a great lever for that. It is one of those options to do that. So I think it's really interesting and to see that sort of that spread of people thinking that. But what I do take away from that as well is that at least 30%, so at least almost a third, there are people thinking, well, people, executives, if not everybody, should be held to account for this performance. So I think that's really interesting, and echoes that global conversation that we have seen around, should you introduce ESG metrics to executive pay, and if so, how? I think globally we've seen different practices. We saw a lot of movement initially with introducing measures into the short-term incentive plans. Particularly social measures that looked often inwardly. So things like employee engagement, other social metric there around health and safety. But we are seeing that move more into, long-term incentive plannings, particularly in publicly listed organizations. And that, there has been some skepticism around, is this meaningful? And are we incentivizing the right things? So I think we're at a really interesting stage now that we can sort of take some of these learnings and say, well, how do we then look at this from the future? And the key, I think, is to make sure that it is meaningful, and we are setting the right targets, and as we'll come into that, you're aligning to a strategy. So interesting, I think, looking across the region as well. We have such varied practices in terms of where different locations are at geographically. Australia, there's quite a high penetration of individual organizations who are holding executives to account for the ESG performance through things like long-term incentives and other incentive plans. In Singapore, where we are here, I read a report recently. We've actually got a relatively low penetration in terms of metrics, and I think similar across broader Southeast Asia. But again, lots of differing practices, and I think also this differs again around from different industries as well. If we look at it, it's purest form, and we look at a number of the mining or extractive industry organizations. Things like health and safety have always been a feature and a key metric for executives in those industries, and many examples of that. So that is what we're talking about, ESG metrics from the S there. So how do we then go about this? And I think for me, the starting point is this is not a tick the box exercise. While we might hear ESG everything, and as we've heard, it's really emerging and changing quite rapidly. Just because it's out there or just because other people are doing it does not mean we need to put ESG metrics into our own organization's pay structures. The first principles here are really, and the precursors, if we look at this journey on the screen here, the first is you have to have a robust ESG strategy in the first place. Remuneration should not be the lever for driving your ESG strategy. It should be, it should be a tool that you are using to reinforce your existing ESG strategy. So you cannot start without having a really robust ESG strategy. And as Brian said, quantifying where you need to go. What does good look like? Then we can think about how ESG links it, how remuneration links into that. And the second piece of the data, and I think this is a challenge that many organizations have, that we just don't have the robustness of the data or the systems and processes to monitor all of the things that we want to at this stage. So if we can't do that, it's very challenging to then actually put metrics associated with that into our and pay and hold executives to account. So really, two key stress points before we even get to thinking about linking it into executive pay. That said, if we move to the next slide, 4 key areas in terms of how would you actually go about this? And my first starting point here is this is absolutely no different to any other metric that you might put into a scorecard for your executives. If it's a financial metric about the performance of your organization, total shareholder return, for example, the same level of rigor needs to go through designing your non-financial metrics potentially from an ESG perspective, as would any other metric. So firstly, design. How will you actually incorporate this into your executive remuneration? Through what features, what different plans? Secondly, what are the performance metrics that you're actually going to assess? What is it that you're assessing? What does, we talk about ESG, but what are those metrics you're actually talking about? Thirdly, then we come on to how you're actually going to set your targets. And then finally, what are we disclosing in terms of disclosing and communicating both internally and externally to stakeholders? So let's go through each of these 4 and spend a little bit of time just thinking, well, what would these steps be? So if we move to our next slide here around the design elements. So the first 2 questions here, and this is probably one of the most fundamental questions, is where are you going to include these metrics in your pay structure? So for example, is this going to impact your annual bonus? Or is it going to impact your long-term incentive bonus or equity bonus plans, or any other, is it going to be a standalone plan, for example? So how are you actually going to integrate this into your pay structure? The second question is then really looking at this graphic here comes to the question of, well, what impact then should that have when we do bring it into our plans? So if we look at this spectrum here, we have some of the lower impact features on the left here to say, well, perhaps this is an underpin. And by an underpin, we mean that we continue measuring the performance of our executive against their existing structure and scorecards, for example. But we have some tick the box binary exercises that we say, okay, performance of ESG against this metric, was it achieved or not? Then that dictates whether the performance, we have a gateway into our performance payouts under our plans. Or is this going to be a modifier of our financial performance or the other performance metrics, right through to, are we introducing standalone incentive plans for the performance against our ESG strategy and our targets, because we truly believe that this is so important to us. So I think the key considerations for me here as to how you think about this is, firstly, what is the impact that ESG should have on your overall pay outcomes? Is it something that you're truly standing behind, or is it something that's a kicker for great performance, or are we penalizing non-achievement against our strategy? So really that fundamental of how much impact should this have. The second one is around this: what is the right balance between all the other things that your executives have to do? So it's great to talk about ESG, but also the context of what is the performance and the strategy of your organization, and getting the right balance between those. And then thirdly is this idea about timeframes. And I think this is probably one of the more challenging things in terms of, we heard before about, are we looking to absolute outcomes, or are we making progress towards something? And then what are the relevant timeframes to do that? We then move into metrics, which is probably one of the most important areas and the one that gets the most scrutiny. So the key here for me is, we have on this chart, a number of different metrics that we are seeing have been introduced into, reward scorecards, executive incentive plans under each of the environmental, the social, and the governance categories. And there really are a myriad of different options here. But the key here for me, and I think your stakeholders, particularly any investors, will look at the questions they're going to ask are these actually meaningful for your organization? What are you setting out to do, and how does this align to both your ESG strategy and your broader organizational strategy? So it's great that you think of some of these metrics, and they might be interesting things to know. But if you don't want to, if you can't hold your executives to account for things that actually is not part of meaningful for your strategy and your direction or where you're heading. And the second piece probably is here, do you have sufficient information to actually meaningfully quantify them? Again, that data piece. The third thing, looking at on the next slide then, is target setting. And this is probably one of the most challenging things I think that many organizations are grappling with, not only from a reward perspective, but Brian, I think, mentioned earlier around, well, if you're setting an ESG targets for your organization, how are you coming up with that? Do you have the robust data? So for me, two lenses here. Again, if you're going to put these into your executive incentive plans, what is the strategy and what are you setting out to do? What is the data quality and your ability to actually collect and baseline this, which I think is absolutely essential. And then thinking about, well, what does good actually look like? So are we talking about achieving outcomes here? Or do we need more flexibility in the way we measure and hold our executives account? For example, rather than binary targets, should we be setting ranges around this? Because actually we realize that, progress towards this is most essential. And then, we need to reward that. And then finally, I think a word of caution on discretion. So we have seen when new metrics like this, and particularly non-financial metrics like this, are put into scorecards, some skepticism around how you can actually measure them correctly or accurately, but also the desire to then want to overlay some discretion for this. And typically discretion in this sense is frowned on often when we're setting targets like this, and often external stakeholders are looking to use discretion in a downward fashion. So I think some complexities there in terms of setting targets. You have to be very clear on what you're doing and very aligned to your baseline strategy there. So I think this is probably one of the key challenges for many organizations. And finally, we look at disclosure, which to me is one of the biggest opportunities. So as you can see on the next slide here, what we're talking about is the ability to provide transparency on what these targets are, both to your internal stakeholders and your external stakeholders. So if we could just flick to the next slide, thank you. In terms of, the powerfulness, I think, is if you can actually set prospective targets and you can share this prospectively with your relevant stakeholders, whether they be internal or external. The powerful nature of this in terms of what this does in terms of setting the direction and getting buy-in from your stakeholders can be absolutely really terrific there. So I think something to balance there between prospectively actually sharing these targets and committing externally and internally to what you're going to achieve, and that you're holding your people to account for this. Balancing that with commercial sensitivity as well is probably the final piece there. So I think we have, this is clearly a very overview, and we could delve depth into each one of these for quite some time. But I think it's a really interesting, starting point to think about, how we might actually integrate these sorts of measures if you're thinking about it. But my first principle, starting point, make sure this is meaningful and aligned to what you're actually challenging your executives to do, what your company is setting out to do, and making sure this links back to your existing strategies and what you've externally committed to doing as well. Jod, I think if we hand it back to you.
Sure. Okay. If we can move through to the final slide, slide 29. And maybe Simon, if I can invite you back in just to cover off this slide.
Sure. Thanks. So I guess in the last few minutes, it would be remiss of us not to talk about the G in ESG and remuneration context, and probably for me, I think there's some key headlines that I've observed over the last couple of months from different locations across the region, and you can see that things are changing. So in Singapore, we're starting from different baseline in terms of regulations on remuneration in each different country. But I think a common theme is that we are seeing more movement in this space and a desire for regulators to apply more scrutiny and rather than less, and look for more transparency rather than less. So you can see here examples from Singapore, the upcoming disclosure requirements for remuneration for listed companies from SGX. Those in Malaysia also, looking to require organizations to do more regular reviews of board remuneration, as well as Australia changes in gender pay reporting as well. So I think things are changing. So it's hard to capture the regulations all in one bucket, but I think what this says to me is, prepare for more scrutiny rather than less. And if we go back to how you prepare yourself for that, is being really clear on exactly what you pay for and what you don't and why. Being prepared to communicate the rationale about why you do things, particularly around executive pay, and the decision making that you use to get there. Because I think these sorts of things are what external stakeholders are looking for. So really getting your house in order to make sure that you are paying the way that's the right way for you. It's the right way that aligns to your corporate strategy, but also your ESG strategy as well. So I think that's my tag phrase for this is probably let's not necessarily talk about ESG, but let's talk about paying the right way.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Brian and Simon. This brings us to the end of today's discussion. We now have a little bit of time to respond to some of the questions from the audience. So maybe, Brian, if I can bring you in here for the first challenges for companies in managing ESG risks.
Sure, of course. Yeah, thanks for that. I believe this is also a common challenge for many companies. I can see the challenge come from two major dimensions. Of course, I mean, there are always other challenges. For example, how you can get the buy-in from the top, how you can make sure that your different colleagues are doing what you expected. As mentioned by Simon, I mean, this is something related back to performance review, employee reward as well. But in terms of looking at managing ESG risks, I can say the first challenge, of course, is how a companies can look at the risk angle beyond their operations, right? Because, for example, when we talk about ESG risk, many of those will come from your supply chain. Imagine those global leading, apparel brand or those electronic brands, right? They don't really own their factories, but if something happened in their factory, in their suppliers' factories, like no matter child labor or the workers' protest, they would got into trouble as well. But somehow, those risks that happen in the suppliers also become part of the risk of their companies as well. So, in under the condition that they may not be able to control their suppliers, they will need to think about programs to identify and then manage and engage with those along their value chain to manage and mitigate the risk. So I think this is one of the challenge. Another one which is very critical one that Simon also touched about is about the data as well. So ESG data is always a challenging part. How to ensure the data quality, how to ensure that companies have good process and control, and then how the quality of the data can be linked back to the performance review of different uh, individuals or departments within your organization is something that is very critical, because if you can't manage that, you need to measure that first. So you need to measure your data, but understanding that most of the companies are still just begin to manage the ESG data. So it will be something that companies will need to invest more time to look at how to have proper process and control on ESG data. So I think these are the two major challenges that I see companies are facing when they are looking at the whole holistic ESG management.
Thank you, Brian. And just to add to that, I think it was incredibly fortunate timing. This morning there was an article in the Straits Times here in Singapore, just around 5 of our very well-known organizations here in the region that have proactively signed up to the new standards of sustainability reporting as part of the first 300 companies globally that have done so, which is an indication, I think, as Brian was talking and both Simon, that this is already here. And we expect that to only increase, and the focus and the scrutiny on this to increase and to apply to more organizations across the entire region over the months and years ahead. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. We hope that you found the content informative in helping you to prepare for the commercial and talent imperatives and the increased reporting requirements that we expect to see in the years ahead. If you have any further questions or are interested in exploring this topic further, please do not hesitate to contact us directly. A huge thank you to Brian and Simon, and special thanks to all of you who were able to join us today. We would very much like to encourage you to fill out the short survey that will pop up on your screen in a moment and tell us what you thought of today's program. If you joined us late, please note that this presentation will be archived for future viewing. If you feel that others would benefit from this webcast, please do share the share this icon, or have them visit the Dbriefs website and they can sign up directly from there. We will respond to all of the additional questions that were raised during the session over the coming weeks. And please don't forget to tune in to our next scheduled webcast from the Geography Update series on 12th of March, entitled Hong Kong SAR Budget 2024-2025 Commentary. And finally, from all of us at Deloitte, thank you very much for your participation in Deloitte's Asia Pacific Tax webcast today. Have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you.